We've already put down a deposit for you, Mom. It's a surprise. Imagine no more worries." The words from Laura, my daughter-in-law, didn't so much sound as they fell into the silence of the living room like heavy stones into still water. I froze, feeling the glossy coolness of the brochure she had just placed in my hands begin to burn my fingers. On the cover, a smiling, white-haired couple played chess on a perfectly manicured lawn. The title, rendered in gold letters, felt like a mockery. "Golden Years Villa." I lifted my gaze. They were both my son David and his wife looking at me with that particular, practiced concern that people reserve for the very old or the terminally ill. Their smiles were wide, sincere, and it was precisely this sincerity that made everything inside of me begin to slowly crack, like thin ice under a sudden weight. I said nothing. I simply nodded silently, as if accepting this gift, and slowly rose from my armchair. My body moved on inertia, on a habit honed over decades of service. I went to the kitchen to slice the apple pie they had brought. Their laughter drifted in, fragmented, mixing with the news from the television. They were already discussing something else, the renovation of their own kitchen, an upcoming vacation. And I stood at the counter. The only sound I could clearly hear was a hum in my own ears. The aroma of cinnamon and baked apples, which usually filled me with warmth, now felt suffocating, foreign. The knife entered the soft crust with a barely audible crunch. I cut 3 slices. 3 perfectly even slices. I placed them on the plates I took from the sideboard, the same special ones my husband and I had bought for our silver wedding anniversary. For them, always the best for them. When they finally left, leaving behind a faint trail of expensive perfume and pie crumbs on the tablecloth, I stood by the door for a long time. This time, their farewell, a quick kiss on the cheek from David, an airy one from Laura, felt different, as if they weren't saying goodbye until next weekend, but for good. Returning to the living room, I saw the teacups they'd left behind, still half full. I picked them up, one by one, and carried them to the sink. Hot water, steam, the smell of dish soap. Methodically, slowly, I washed each cup, erasing the traces of her lipstick, the prints of their fingers, the residue of their care. It was almost a ritual, a cleansing. I felt neither anger nor resentment, only a deafening, icy emptiness and silence. The silence of a house that had suddenly ceased to be my home and had turned into a piece of real estate, an asset to be sold. With a clean cup in my hand, I sat down at the kitchen table, in the very seat where my husband used to sit. A ray of sunlight fell on the wall, illuminating an old photograph, my daughter, Anna, still so young, laughing as she hugged me on the day she was accepted into university. And a memory, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the fog of oblivion. I remembered the day I sold what was part of my soul. It wasn't just an easel and paints. It was a collection of handmade oil paints I had gathered for years, seeking out rare pigments in small shops during our travels with my husband. Each tube held a story. And the easel, old oak, a gift from him at the very beginning of our life together, covered in multicolored stains like a map of my unrealized paintings. I sold it all to an old artist from a small studio on the edge of town. He looked at me with a sad understanding. "These are not just tools, madam. This is a dream," he said quietly, counting out the crumpled bills. But all I could think about then was that my daughter's dream to become a lawyer was more important. A child's happiness is the finest work of art. I repeated to myself like a mantra as I placed the money in an envelope for Anna. She took it, gave me a quick kiss, and ran off to call her friends. She didn't even ask where the money came from. And then came the memory of David, not just one, but a whole series of them. There he was, calling, excited, telling me about a brilliant business idea that just needed a little startup capital. There I was at the bank, transferring money from the joint account my husband and I had the very $40,000 we had saved for our old age, for the trip to Italy we had dreamed of. The bank teller looked at me with sympathy, and I felt shame, as if I were betraying my husband's memory, but also pride I was helping my son. Then came the smaller amounts, to pay off a credit card, for a prestigious car for Laura because it was important for his image. Every one of their calls began with questions about my health and ended with a request, and I gave, because I am a mother. I am the keeper. I felt like a ghost in my own memories, a caretaker of a house where I no longer had a place. They were packaging my eviction as an act of love, and that invalidation was simply suffocating. I got up and walked slowly to my husband's study. His heavy oak desk stood in the same spot. I hadn't sat at it since the day he died, but now my fingers confidently found the handle of the top drawer. I opened it. The smell of old paper and wood. There, in a leather folder, lay all our documents. I took out the will. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the thick paper. The wording was clear and ruthless in its simplicity. All my property, movable and immovable, including the house at the address, I bequeath to my wife, Eleanor, not to our family, not to my wife and children, to my wife, Eleanor. They had never asked. They had simply assumed it would all automatically become theirs. Their very confidence had become my weapon. I found a number in an old address book. The community center, free legal aid for seniors. The woman's voice on the other end was calm and businesslike. I briefly, without emotion, explained the situation. The answer was as simple and clear as the text of the will. You are the sole and rightful owner. No one can force you to sell your home or move anywhere without your personal, notarized consent. After hanging up, I felt something else begin to grow in the place of the icy void in my chest. Something solid, unshakable. My next steps led me to the attic. Creaking stairs, the smell of dust and dry wood. In the far corner, under an old sheet, I found what I was looking for. A heavy wooden box. I brought it downstairs, into the living room, and placed it on the coffee table, directly on top of that glossy Golden Years brochure. I opened it. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil hit my nostrils, resurrecting the ghosts of the past. These were my husband's paints. Many of the tubes had already dried up, turned to stone, a symbol of his abandoned dream, and of mine. I sat in silence for a long time, just looking at them. That night, I understood that my greatest mistake was not that I gave too much, but that I forgot to leave a little paint for my own canvas. I walked to my husband's desk, took out a clean sheet of paper and his favorite pen. In a steady, firm hand, I wrote the first point of my new plan. 1. Make an appointment with the notary. The appointment with the notary, made that evening, became the first stitch in the fabric of my new life. His office had none of the emotional turmoil that had been raging inside me for the past few days. It was an oasis of calm, heavy drapes that muffled the city sounds, the scent of polished wood and old leather, the quiet hum of a computer. I sat in a deep armchair across from him, a gray-haired man in a perfectly pressed shirt, and felt my body relax. Everything here, from the stacks of paper, neatly arranged on the edge of his desk, to the measured ticking of the wall clock, spoke of order, of rules. And that was precisely why I had come, to restore the rules in my own world. When he asked how he could help, I looked him directly in the eye. I wish to draw up a new will, I said, and my voice sounded surprisingly steady, without a hint of a tremor. And also to nullify any prior powers of attorney issued in the name of my son David. My heart wasn't pounding. I did not hesitate. This was not an emotional outburst. This was the beginning of a repair. When I returned home, I didn't rush immediately to papers or the telephone. Instead, I changed into my old clothes and went out into the garden. The roses I had been watering on the day my world fractured were now bowing their heads. I took my pruning shears and began to methodically deadhead the withered blooms. Each snip was precise and deliberate. Click, asterisk, another dead head fell to the ground. Click, asterisk, I pulled the weeds that had managed to sprout at the base of the bushes, my fingers sinking into the warm, damp earth. This simple, physical labor was grounding. I wasn't thinking about the past or the future. I was simply bringing order to a small patch of land, pulling out what was choking the healthy growth. It was clear. It was honest. I felt as if, along with the garden debris, I was discarding the last remnants of self-pity from my soul. The following weeks turned into a meticulously executed checklist. First came the legal repair. I found myself back in the notary's office, signing papers. The new will was simple and concise. The house, the savings, everything I owned, I bequeathed not to my children, but to a charitable foundation that supported young, emerging artists. This wasn't a punishment. It was a restoration of justice. I was returning my unrealized dream to the world. Then I signed the document revoking the power of attorney. The notary explained that David would now have no legal right to make financial decisions on my behalf. I felt as if a heavy, invisible burden had been lifted from my shoulders. Next was the financial repair. The visit to the bank, where I had once withdrawn money for my son with a mix of shame and pride, now felt different. I sat across from a young bank manager, and when she brought up my account information on the screen, I saw his name next to mine. For a fleeting moment, a warm memory surfaced. A little David, maybe 5 years old, holding my hand tightly as we put his first coin into a piggy bank. His eyes had shone with delight. How did that little boy become a man who saw me only as a resource? I took a quiet breath. "Please," I said calmly, pointing to the screen. "Remove this individual's access to all of my accounts. And I would like to change all the passwords for my online banking." The manager nodded, asking no questions, and began to click away at her keyboard. Each click of the mouse sounded to me like the music of freedom. Of course, they started to notice. First came the missed calls, then the messages on the answering machine. One evening, as I was preparing dinner for myself, a simple meal, for one I pressed the play button. Laura's voice, sweet as poisoned honey, filled the kitchen. "Mom, we're so worried you're not answering. We just want to make sure you're okay." David is beside himself. I listened in silence, slicing a tomato. They weren't worried. They were alarmed. Alarmed that an asset they had already mentally liquidated was suddenly showing signs of independent thought. I deleted the message before it finished. The final chord was the physical repair. I called a locksmith. The sound of the drill boring out the old lock cylinder was loud, decisive, and it heralded the end of an era. When the handyman left, I stood in the hallway, holding the new key in my palm. It was shiny, cold, and smooth, without a single scratch. It fit only my door. And only I would decide who to let through it. That same evening, I began this symbolic repair. I took an old box of documents from the closet, my children's birth certificates, their school photos, their first drawings. I didn't feel anger, only a quiet sorrow for what could never be recovered. I didn't throw them away. I carefully placed everything into a new folder, on which I wrote a single word: history. It was the past. It had its place, but that place was in an archive, not in my present. Then I found my old address book. There was their number. I didn't cross it out with fury. I simply drew a single, steady line through it, an act of closure. And finally, I sat down at the computer, opened the website of an art supply store, and began to slowly fill my cart. A new canvas, a set of vibrant oil paints, turpentine, brushes. After finishing my tasks, I felt not exhaustion, but a strange lightness. I put on my coat and left the house. Walking a few blocks, I found myself in front of the small art supply shop I had always loved but hadn't entered in years because it felt impractical. Inside, it smelled of paint and wood. I didn't buy any of the things I had ordered online. Instead, my gaze fell upon a single paintbrush, lying apart from the others. It had a long, elegant handle of dark wood and soft, resilient bristles. I picked it up, feeling its perfect weight in my hand. This was not an item of necessity. This was an item for the soul. I walked to the counter and paid for it. It wasn't just a purchase. It was an investment. I was finally investing in myself. The insistent knocking on the front door came on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was beginning to warm the dust motes dancing in the living room. I was sitting in my armchair, a cup of tea cradled in my hands, reading a book. I didn't flinch. I knew who it was before I heard his voice, muffled by the heavy oak door. "Mom? Mom, are you in there? The key isn't working." David's voice was laced with a confusion that was quickly curdling into irritation. A pause, then more knocking, louder this time. "Laura and I have been calling. Is something wrong? Open the door." I took a slow sip of my tea. The porcelain was warm against my lips. I could picture him on the other side of the door, his face clouded with impatience, checking his watch. He wasn't worried about my well-being. He was annoyed by an unexpected obstacle in his day. He was trying to open a door to a house he no longer had a key for, both literally and metaphorically. I stayed silent, turning a page in my book. My own mother used to say, "If they won't hear your words when you whisper, they will be forced to hear your silence when it roars." My silence was roaring now, and for the first time, he was listening. After he finally left, the sound of his car fading down the street, I placed my book down and began a slow walk through the house. It was no longer a frantic search for evidence or a place of grief. It was an inventory, a final tour through the palace of my memory before turning over the keys. I paused first at my husband's old leather armchair. The leather was cracked and worn smooth in the places he always rested his hands. I could almost smell the faint, ghostly scent of his pipe tobacco. A warm memory surfaced. David, a small boy with scraped knees, curled up in this very chair, fast asleep on his father's lap while being read a story about dragons. His small chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm with his father's, but that memory was now layered with a colder one. David, just a few months ago, sitting in that same hallowed chair, not with a book, but with his phone, his thumb swiping endlessly. He'd barely looked up when I spoke to him, his only question of substance being, "Mom, is the house insurance paid up for the quarter?" The chair was the same, but the man in it was a stranger. Next, I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of what used to be Anna's bedroom. The walls were still a pale, buttery yellow, a color we had chosen together one sunny Saturday. I remembered the laughter, the streaks of paint on our faces, the shared joy of creating her own little sanctuary. That was the room of a girl for whom I had sold my own dreams in an envelope. The warmth of that memory was instantly chilled by the recollection of a phone call years ago. Anna, giddy with the excitement of university life, talking about a spring break trip to Mexico she desperately wanted to go on. "It's not that much, Mom," she'd said, oblivious to the fact that her "not that much" was the last of the money from the sale of my art supplies. She never asked. She just assumed the bank of Mom was infinite. My final stop was the kitchen table. For decades, it had been the heart of our home, the stage for countless birthday cakes, homework sessions, and boisterous family dinners. I could close my eyes and hear the echoes, the clatter of silverware, my husband's deep laugh, the children arguing over the last piece of chicken. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. But now, all I could hear was the deafening silence that had followed Laura's announcement. All I could see was the glossy brochure for the Golden Years villa lying on this table, a death sentence for my life here, presented as a gift. The table that had once been a symbol of communion had become the site of my deposition. I returned to the living room and took out a small notebook. With the new paintbrush I had bought my small investment in myself lying beside it like a promise, I made a simple list. On one side I wrote, what to take. The list was short. 1. My husband's paint box and my new supplies. 2. The folder marked history. 3. The new paintbrush. On the other side I wrote, what to leave. The list was even shorter. 1. Everything else. The packing began that afternoon. It was not a frantic, sorrowful task. It was a quiet, methodical ritual. I found a sturdy cardboard box and lined it with soft, clean towels. I first took my husband's old wooden paint box. I ran my hand over the lid, feeling the nicks and scratches of a life well lived. I opened it, breathed in the scent of turpentine and memory one last time, and then closed it gently. I wrapped it in a soft linen cloth, as if swaddling a precious child, and placed it carefully inside the cardboard box. Next to it, I laid the new, untouched canvases and the vibrant, unopened tubes of paint. Lastly, I placed the single, elegant paintbrush on top. A bridge between the past I was honoring and the future I was building, I sealed the box with tape, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. On the side, in neat, clear letters, I wrote 2 words, my studio. When the last piece of tape was smoothed down, I looked around the room. It no longer felt empty. It felt clear, ready for new stories, to be written without me. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, purposeful hum. I was in motion, not fleeing from something, but moving toward something. My mornings began not with a sense of dread, but with a plan. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table, now clear of everything but a notepad and a pen, and called a real estate agent who specialized in small, bright studio apartments near the city's botanical garden. I described what I wanted, a single room with a large window, a place for an easel, and nothing more. The agent's professional, cheerful voice on the other end felt like an affirmation. Later that day, I sat on my porch, sipping iced tea. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a car to pull into the driveway or for the phone to ring. I was simply enjoying the warmth of the sun on my skin and the scent of my roses. I thought of David, not with anger, but with a strange, distant clarity. I wasn't mourning the man who had tried to knock down my door. I was mourning the idea of him, the little boy with scraped knees, asleep in his father's chair, a phantom I had clung to for far too long. The unexpected call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The caller ID was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, my voice calm. It wasn't David. It wasn't Laura. It was Anna, my daughter. Her voice was small, tentative, a ghost of the confident lawyer she had become. Mom, she said, and the word was freighted with uncertainty. It's me. There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of the rain against the window pane. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't immediately offer forgiveness like a balm. The new me, the one who was carefully repairing her own foundations, needed to know if this apology was real or just another tool. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the gentle rhythm of the rain, and asked softly, for what, specifically, "Are you sorry, Anna?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation for her to look at the truth. There was another silence, longer this time. I could hear her take a shaky breath. For never asking," she finally said, her voice cracking. "For taking. For just assuming you were. A well that would never run dry. I'm sorry I never saw you, Mom. Only what you could do for me." The words were clumsy, painful, but they were honest. It was the first honest thing I had heard from either of my children in years. "All right," I said, my own voice even. "You can come over. Tomorrow at 3. But Anna, come alone." She arrived precisely on time. The rain had stopped, and the world outside smelled clean and new. When I opened the door, I saw a woman who looked smaller than I remembered, her usual polished confidence stripped away, leaving something vulnerable in its place. I didn't embrace her. I simply stepped aside and let her in. The house was quiet and smelled of lemon polish and old wood. I led her to the kitchen and gestured for her to sit at the table. I had baked a simple loaf of bread that morning, and the aroma still lingered. I sliced 2 pieces and poured 2 glasses of water. No fancy pie, no celebratory tea, just the basics. Sustenance. We sat in an awkward silence for a moment before she began to speak. She explained how David's panicked calls had started, how he and Laura had spun a narrative of me being unwell, unstable. But then, she said, she had found the brochure for the Golden Years villa in their recycling bin. "I just copied them," she admitted, looking at her hands resting on the table. It was easier. David was always the leader, and I just followed. I wanted to belong to the idea of the perfect family that Laura was always posting about. I listened, without judgment. When she finished, I simply nodded. "You didn't want to belong to them, Anna?" I said gently. "You were afraid of being left out. There's a difference." My words weren't meant to absolve her, but to help her see the architecture of her own choices. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. Can I fix this? Can I come back?" This was the moment, the final test of my new walls. I looked at my daughter, not the idealized memory, but the flawed woman sitting before me, and I saw a flicker of the girl who once painted yellow walls with me. "Yes," I said, "but not for what you used to come for. Not for money or solutions or a place to unburden yourself without thought. You can come back for the truth, for an honest conversation, for a slice of bread and a glass of water, with nothing else expected." I paused, then pushed the plate with her slice of bread a little closer to her. "That is the new price of admission." She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and took a small bite. After she left, carrying with her another slice of bread wrapped in a simple napkin, I stood by the window and watched her car disappear. The house was filled with the soft, fading light of the afternoon. A deep sense of peace settled over me, a peace that was not about victory, but about understanding. Perhaps some doors are not meant to be slammed shut and bolted forever. Perhaps they are meant to be quietly locked from the inside, leaving just a small window ajar, open only for those who learn to knock gently and who are willing to enter alone. The day I went to sign the lease was bright and clear, the kind of early autumn day that feels like a crisp, new beginning. I dressed with intention, choosing a simple navy blue dress and the silk scarf my husband had given me on our last anniversary. It felt like armor, but a soft, elegant kind. The real estate agent's office was modern and minimalist, filled with the clean scent of paper and ambition. She led me to a small, glass-walled room where the documents were laid out on a polished table. I didn't need to deliberate. I had already seen the apartment. It was a single, light-drenched room on the top floor of an old brick building with a massive arched window that overlooked the botanical gardens. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. The sounds from the street below were muted, distant, like a gentle hum. I had stood in the center of that empty room and felt not a sense of loss for the large house I was leaving, but a profound sense of relief. It was a canvas, not a museum. Without a moment's hesitation, I took the pen the agent offered its weight cool and solid in my hand and signed my name on the designated line. The ink was a dark, definitive black. As a final gesture, I handed her a cashier's check for the first 3 months of rent. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a declaration of independence, paid for in cash. That evening, as I began the slow, meditative process of packing, David came again. This time, there was no angry knocking, just a soft, hesitant rap on the door, like a child afraid of waking a sleeping parent. I was in the living room, carefully wrapping the old family photographs, the ones from the folder marked "History" in tissue paper. I paused, the crinkle of the paper loud in the silence. His voice came through the door, strained and thin. "Mom, please, can we just talk?" I walked to the door but didn't open it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood. "There's nothing to talk about, David," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm selling the house." "You can't," he protested, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "This is our family home. Dad would have never wanted this." It was his first manipulation, the appeal to a dead man's authority. "Your father," I replied, my voice perfectly even, "left this house to me, to Eleanor. He trusted me to live my life in it. He never intended for it to become a golden cage or a financial asset for you to liquidate. His next attempt was an appeal to guilt. But what about us? What about your grandchildren? Where will we all gather for Christmas?" I closed my eyes, picturing all the Christmases I had single-handedly orchestrated. "Gatherings," I said, "are built on love and respect, David, not on the square footage of a building. We haven't had a real gathering in years." He was silent for a moment. Then came the final, desperate plea. "I'm sorry, Mom, okay? I'm sorry. Just let me in." It was the same hollow apology Anna had first offered, and I met it with the same quiet demand for truth. "I heard you, David," I said. "Now go home and think about what specifically you are sorry for." I heard him sigh, a sound of utter defeat. A few moments later, the sound of his footsteps receded from the porch. I stood there for a long time, and then the tears came. Not a storm, but a quiet, steady rain. 7 minutes of grief for the son I had lost long before I locked the door. When it was over, I wiped my eyes, went back to the box of photographs, and finished my work. The next afternoon, I hosted a small tea party. My new family. There was Margaret, my neighbor, a retired librarian with a wicked sense of humor, and Clara, a fellow gardener I'd met at the local nursery. We sat in the sun-drenched living room, surrounded by neatly stacked boxes, the scent of bergamot and old books filling the air. The conversation was a warm, gentle current of everyday life. Margaret told a hilarious story about a man trying to return a book he had checked out in 1978. Clara lamented about the aphids on her prize-winning roses, and we strategized on the best organic solutions. It was simple. It was real. "Well, ladies," I announced, pouring more tea, "this is a bit of a farewell party. I've signed a lease on a new apartment. I'm moving at the end of the month." Their reactions were not of shock or pity, but of pure, unadulterated joy. Margaret raised her teacup. "2 new chapters," she declared. Clara beamed. "And to bigger windows for all your new plants." We laughed, and in that moment, surrounded by their genuine warmth, I knew I had made the right choice. Laura arrived the next day, unannounced. She used her own key, a copy David must have given her ages ago, one I had forgotten existed. She let herself in, her presence instantly sucking the warmth from the room. She was dressed in a crisp, white pantsuit, looking more like a hostile lawyer than a daughter-in-law. Her face was a mask of righteous indignation. "I cannot believe you are doing this to him," she began, her voice sharp. "After everything we've done for you." I calmly placed the book I was reading on the table beside me. "What exactly have you done for me, Laura?" I asked, my tone genuinely curious. "Except, of course, choosing a retirement home and putting a deposit on it without my consent." Her face flushed. "We were trying to help, to take the burden off you. This house is too much for you to handle. Manipulation number 1, feigned concern. The only burden," I replied calmly, "has been the weight of your expectations. This house was never too much for me." "It was, however, not enough for you." She switched tactics, appealing to the family she so carefully curated on her blog. "You are tearing this family apart. What will people think?" "I have a reputation." Manipulation number 2, social pressure. I almost smiled. "My dear, you don't have a family. You have an audience. And I am no longer part of the cast." Finally, she went for the jugular. "You are being selfish. A mother's job is to sacrifice. You are abandoning your children." I leaned forward slightly. "My greatest mistake was not that I gave too much," I said, the words coming out cool and clear as glass. "It was that I forgot to leave a little paint for my own canvas. My job as a mother was to raise my children into independent, compassionate adults. My work is done. Your financial problems are not my responsibility to solve." That was the truth that broke her. Her composure shattered. "You'll be all alone," she spat, her voice venomous. "You'll die alone in some tiny, sad apartment, and no one will even know." I looked at her, at this angry, frightened woman, and felt not hatred, but a profound pity. I stood up and walked over to the stack of boxes. From the one marked My Studio, I pulled out the new lease agreement. I held it up for her to see. "I won't be alone, Laura," I said, my voice filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I will be with me." Her face crumpled. She saw the signatures, the official seal, the irrefutable proof that her plans had turned to dust. She stared at the paper, then at me, her eyes wide with a disbelief that slowly morphed into hatred. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The door clicked shut, the sound punctuating the end of a sentence, the end of a book. I felt no joy, no triumph, only stillness. But this time, it wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of sovereignty. The finality of it all arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but in a plain manila envelope delivered by the morning post. Inside was a letter from my solicitor. I sat at my nearly bare kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in, and read the crisp, formal sentences. All titles had been cleared, all accounts secured, all legal ties redefined. The letter concluded with a line his secretary had clearly typed, but which I knew came directly from him. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance, please be advised that you are now the sole and sovereign author of every inch of your life. Act accordingly." I folded the letter and placed it in the box labeled My Studio. My final practical act of independence was almost comically mundane. I walked to the end of the long driveway and retrieved the key to the community postbox from its little slot, dropping my old house keys into the outbox for the new owners. The metallic clink was a tiny, satisfying full stop. Anna called that afternoon and asked if she could visit one last time. When she arrived, the atmosphere was entirely different. The house, mostly empty and echoing, no longer felt like a battleground, but like a theater after the final curtain call. We didn't talk about the drama. Instead, we sat on the living room floor, sharing simple shortbread cookies from a tin, the kind my own mother used to make. The silence between us was no longer fraught with unspoken resentments, but filled with a quiet, fragile understanding. "Dad says you've lost your mind," Anna murmured, not as an accusation, but as a reported fact. She stared at the patterns on the old hardwood floor. I smiled faintly. "No, my dear. He thinks I've lost my mind because he's lost his resource. He isn't mourning me. He's mourning the version of me that existed only to serve his needs. There's a difference." She nodded, accepting this truth without argument. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed sketch. It was a drawing of a single, powerful-looking oak tree, its branches reaching defiantly toward the sky. It was drawn with simple, confident charcoal lines. At the bottom, in her neat handwriting, were the words, "For Eleanor," who remembered her roots and grew new branches. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The girl who used to paint yellow walls with me was still in there, after all. "Thank you, Anna," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion that wasn't sadness, but a deep, resonant gratitude. "This will have a place of honor in my new home. I knew our relationship would never be what it once was, and for that I was thankful. It was being rebuilt, slowly, on a new, more honest foundation." The morning of the move was still and quiet, the air holding the cool promise of dawn. I rose before the movers arrived and walked through the empty house one last time. The rooms, stripped of furniture, seemed larger, filled with the ghosts of laughter and tears. I ran my hand along the wooden banister, worn smooth by the passage of our family's hands. I stood in the doorway of David's old room, remembering the sound of his toy trains. I stood in the kitchen and could almost smell the phantom scent of 1,000 birthday cakes, but there was no pain. Only a profound sense of gratitude for the life that had been lived here. Before I left, I placed a single, polished key on the clean kitchen counter. Beside it, I left a small, handwritten note for the new family. "May you fill this house with as much love as it has known. Cherish it." Then I walked out the front door, pulled it closed, and did not look back. My new apartment was a world away. It smelled of fresh paint and linseed oil, and the light from the enormous window flooded every corner, chasing away all shadows. A young man from the building management met me downstairs and handed me my keys, along with a single, perfect white orchid in a small pot. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he said with a warm smile. The movers were efficient and respectful, placing the few boxes exactly where I asked. When they left, I was alone in the bright, beautiful space. The first thing I unpacked was the small electric kettle, a simple comfort. The second was Anna's drawing of the oak tree, which I propped up on the wide windowsill where it could catch the morning sunday. The third was the box labeled "My Studio." I opened it and took out my husband's worn paint box, placing it on the floor beneath the window. It looked perfectly at home. My new routine settled into a gentle, unhurried rhythm. A few days after moving in, while searching for an old recipe book, I found a letter tucked inside. It was from my husband, written on our 10th anniversary. His familiar, strong handwriting filled the page. I read the last line, a line I had forgotten. "My dearest Eleanor, never forget that the greatest masterpiece you will ever create is a life lived on your own terms. Your art is your own." The words were a blessing from the past, an affirmation that resonated across the years. That afternoon, I baked a loaf of bread, not for anyone else, but for the simple pleasure of it, the feel of the dough beneath my hands, the warm, yeasty smell filling my small, perfect space. Anna visited again that weekend. She didn't come bearing apologies, but a bag of fresh lemons from the farmer's market. We sat by the large window, sipping tea and talking about her work, about the new book I was reading, about the funny habits of my new neighbors. It was easy. It was normal. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "Is this what peace feels like?" she asked, a genuine curiosity in her eyes. I looked around my sunlit room, at the easel waiting patiently in the corner, at her drawing of the strong oak tree. "No," I said softly, "this is not all of peace, but it is a piece of it, a piece that is entirely mine." I didn't miss the big house. I didn't miss the silence of my children or the strained smiles at holidays. Most of all, I didn't miss the old version of myself, the woman who whispered, "Maybe next time they will see you," because I saw myself now. And I no longer. The news of the house sale arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my old life had shattered. It came not with a bang, but a quiet email from my solicitor with the subject line, "Finalized." I read the attached documents, saw the final sum, and felt not a pang of nostalgia or loss, but a serene sense of completion. The money, now sitting in a newly established trust account, was no longer just currency. It was potential. It was fuel for dreams, just not my own anymore. The next day, I dressed in the same simple navy dress I had worn to sign my lease, a quiet uniform of my newfound sovereignty. I walked to the downtown office of the Charitable Foundation for Young Artists, the one I had designated in my will. The director, a woman with kind, intelligent eyes, met me in a modest office filled with sketches and sculptures. I didn't make a speech. I simply handed her the certified check. She looked at the amount, her eyes widening slightly, then looked back at me, a question forming on her lips. Before she could ask, I answered it. "This is for the artists who have been told their dreams are a luxury," I said, my voice steady. "It's for the ones who need to buy back their time." She nodded, a deep understanding passing between us. As I left, I felt a lightness in my step. I had wept all my tears for that house. This act was not born of grief. It was an act of pure intention. My new apartment had, in a few short months, become a true sanctuary. It was a safe harbor not just for me, but for the fragile, rebuilding relationship with my daughter. Anna visited one rainy Saturday afternoon, carrying not flowers or food, but a small cardboard box. "Can I keep this here?" she asked, her voice low. It's my journals, the ones I've been writing in. Laura, she went through my things the other day. I don't feel safe with them at home." I took the box from her hands, its weight both physical and symbolic. "Of course," I said, clearing a space for it on the top shelf of my closet. "It will be safe here." We sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, a comfortable silence between us. "Do you think they'll ever change?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I considered the question, not with bitterness, but with the dispassionate clarity of a naturalist observing a species. "The better question, my dear," I replied, "is can they ever stop pretending? The people they are in private have finally been revealed. The change you're hoping for isn't transformation, it's just a return to a more convincing performance." She nodded, a sad wisdom dawning in her eyes. When she left, the small box in my closet felt like an anchor, securing our new bond in a place of trust and truth. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was David's. I opened it with steady hands. The letter was short, a rambling mix of self-pity, confusion, and what he likely believed was remorse. He wrote that he missed my apple pies, that the family felt broken, that he didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. He ended with a simple, desperate question: "Can we ever go back?" I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a drawer in my small writing desk. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness wasn't a transaction, and absolution wasn't mine to give. The letter could exist in that drawer, a relic of a past I no longer inhabited, but it would cast no shadow on my present. My 72nd birthday arrived, not with a flurry of unwanted obligations, but with the gentle quiet of a new day. I woke to the soft morning light filtering through my large window and made myself a small stack of pancakes, just for one. I ate them slowly, savoring each bite, accompanied by a cup of strong black coffee and the sound of a quiet jazz station on the radio. There were no false wishes, no strained phone calls, no gifts given with an expectation of return. It was perfect. At noon, Anna arrived. She didn't bring a lavish present, but a single, handmade card. On the front was a watercolor painting of a large, arched window, just like mine, with a tiny figure inside holding a paintbrush. Inside, she had written, "Happy birthday, Mom. Thank you for showing me what it looks like to build your own view." Her words were a greater gift than any amount of money could buy. We talked for hours, not about the past, but about the future, her plans to volunteer at a legal aid clinic, my idea to start a small art class for seniors in my building. As she was leaving, she paused and looked at me, a small smile on her face. "You look different," she said, "happier, like someone who has stopped flinching." My days settled into a beautiful, quiet rhythm. In one corner of my apartment, a fiddle-leaf fig tree, a rescue from a local nursery. Its leaves, once brown and brittle, was now sprouting new, glossy green leaves. It was a quiet testament to the power of care and sunlight. My friends, Margaret and Clara, came for tea every Friday, our laughter filling the small space, a warmer and more genuine sound than any that had ever echoed through the halls of my old house. One afternoon, a text message notification lit up my phone. It was from David. "Happy birthday, Mom." I read the words, felt a flicker of the old sadness, and then let it go, like a breath. I put the phone down, face down on the table, and returned to my book. That evening, I sat at my small wooden table, the one that served as my dining table, my writing desk, and my workspace. I opened a new journal to a clean page. The question from Laura's final venomous visit echoed in my mind. What will you do, all alone? And the question from David's letter, can we ever go back? Now, finally, I had the answer to both. They wondered how I could live without them, I wrote, the pen flowing smoothly across the paper. They wondered what would become of me. Today, I can finally answer. I am living to remember my own name. I am living to set my own table. And I am living to keep my door open just a little for the few who know how to knock with clean hands.